Hello and welcome to the Rogers Brief. I'm Adam Rogers. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening. I'm going to talk about day 53 of the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings, which actually took place yesterday. And I was able to listen to much of the proceeding time during I was on the road, I was driving, listening to it by telephone, which is a handy way actually. If you're not able to sit down in front of a computer to watch the proceedings, you can call in. It's a toll-free number to listen in to what's taking place during the proceedings. And then I caught up on the rest of it today. I would have posted this yesterday now, but it's actually a fairly big weekend here in Guysborough where I live. There's a big fast pitch tournament on this weekend, and in advance of the games yesterday, which I was pitched at 6 p.m., there was a 4 p.m. game which I was coaching with the under 11 team. So all of that meant I wasn't able to watch the end of the proceedings and prepare a report yesterday, Friday afternoon. But here I am Saturday morning, caught up on the proceedings, and here have reviewed the documents that the two witnesses had authored and were referencing during their testimony. And so what it was talking about using forensic psychology to assess the killer, Gabriel Wortman. So that was, when I saw this, I was like, well, that's an interesting topic, certainly. And there were two reports provided by these authors, Christy Martyr and Tess Neal. One was over 100 pages long. The other one was about 50 pages. So I'll get into those documents a little bit. But first of all, let's talk about the people involved. Christy Martyr is from the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. And she was present in Halifax for her testimony. And Tess Neal is at Arizona State University, and she was also present in Halifax for her testimony, not appearing by Zoom as many others have that have been called upon to testify from across the oceans and around the world. So that was interesting in itself, I thought. Questionable use of resources to bring these two individuals here in person. So I'll tell you first what they were not hired to do. They were not hired to perform a psychological autopsy or forensic psychological autopsy of the killer. In fact, what they were hired to do was to perform an assessment of the RCMP's psychological assessment of the killer, which was provided. Now, you'd be like, oh, well, why don't we call on the author of that report and have them come in to talk about their conclusions? Well, I guess that's possible, and maybe that'll happen. But we don't even have that report. We don't have the RCMP psychological assessment. It's not published on the Mass Casualty Commission website. All we have is a summary, about a 27-page summary, which does not go into the individual deaths and assess each one of them in terms of these categories that the RCMP assessor developed. So it's all of limited use, which is really unfortunate because it's a potentially interesting topic. Now, just note that bringing these experts in, one from Australia, one from Arizona, and in fact, we have fairly significant forensic psychology capabilities here in Nova Scotia at St. Mary's University. I've seen presentations at the Canadian Bar Association conferences. Just curious as to why nobody from St. Mary's was called upon to provide an assessment, perhaps, of the killer instead of an assessment of the assessment, which is what this was. But still interesting, because what it shows is some of the RCMP practices and biases have been sort of revealed through the analysis. So the experts actually weren't even sure what to call the RCMP report, because the RCMP refer to it as a psychological assessment, but seemed to say it had elements of a psychological autopsy, a retrospective behavior profile, and a retrospective risk assessment, which in the world of psychology are different things than a psychological autopsy or assessment. So I guess that's interesting in itself. The other thing just to note up front is that the author of the RCMP report, Dr. Matt Logan, is not registered as a certified psychologist anywhere in Canada, although in the report evidently refers to himself as a criminal psychologist. So that's interesting just on the qualifications measure there. So what the experts did, they looked at the report, which we can't see, but they looked at it and asked 108 questions that would be relevant to forensic psychological assessment. And then they compared the report to what they identified as the 8 best practices on bias, on various conflicts of interest, these sorts of things. Compare them to the best practices and see how it stacked up. They found that it was a 78% failure, non-compliance in their terms, with what they would consider to be best practices for these such reports. So a lot of mistakes, a lot of potential errors in the RCMP report. So the bias showed up right away because there was a dedication in the beginning of the RCMP report to fallen members. They say there were very emotive language throughout the report. No identified bias management to say, okay, we know that we are assessing this ourselves, but we've taken these steps to make sure that we are accounting for our own bias. That wasn't done in the RCMP report. And then it talks about how the RCMP has a vested interest in the outcome, and of course they do. So, because if it turned out that Wortman was clearly likely to commit these violent offenses, and nobody noticed it, nobody picked up on it, despite all the contacts that he had with police over the years, then that would make the RCMP look a little bit worse in retrospect, having missed all of those things or not put the pieces together from a criminal intelligence perspective. They said, the authors said that the RCMP did not consider alternate views or potential disagreements. Once they came out with a view of each individual killing and why it happened, then that was it. That was their view, and they didn't think, well, we could be wrong for this and this reasons, and we have to account for this, and there's some doubt or anything like that. They were provided some undue certainty, I guess I put it that way. So reading through some of the media reports, though, so the problem with both reports is it doesn't get into the specifics. It doesn't talk about the Blairs, the McCaulays, the Galensians, it doesn't talk about any individuals, the Tucks, any other of the families, Gina Goulet. None of that was discussed specifically. Now, actually, I noticed yesterday I was tracking it through Twitter as I was between meetings, and I noticed that there was some commentary from Tim Bousquet's Twitter account on the actual individual assessments, but then I think that referred to the original report, which the media I think has but aren't allowed to talk about. So he had to delete those tweets. So when I went to find them again this morning and make some notes, they weren't there. So, but I do remember some of what was said. The Herald, Francis Campbell from the Herald has a good story out this morning as well. I encourage you to take a look at that. So the RCMP report calls the victims in one of 4 categories: either a grievance-based target, that Wortman had some particular problem with them and sought them out specifically; a reactive target, as in, well, all right, you're here now, I guess, and that's it, you can't stay; incidental random target, so just, all right, I'm coming along. I guess probably Andrew McDonald would fit into that, and I believe Kristen Beaton as a random target, just somebody that, I've got to keep moving and you're in my way and you see me, so therefore that's got to, he had to take care of that in his own mind. And then the last one, really controversial in my mind, is called a displacement-based target. So this theory is that Wortman really hated his parents, which is true. And that he saw in these elderly people, anybody really older than him, that they were standing in the place of his parents, somehow reminded him of his parents, and therefore he took out his anger on his parents on these elderly people, like John Zoll, Joanne Thomas, the Galentians. So I really don't see that as a valid opinion. It didn't seem to make sense given what took place. There seemed to be potentially other explanations there, but I have my own theories. I think probably everybody does on why. There's some property issues there going on and such, but of course we don't know that, and we don't have an actual neutral assessment that might give us a little more help with this. A couple of comments from the RCMP report. They talked about how Wortman had a storm was brewing in him for many years. It wasn't just something that snapped, that he had a fragile ego, was sensitive to criticism, and had a high need for control. All of those probably true as well. They seem to be, but that doesn't then lead back to, I really don't see, and there's nothing in the documents that we can see that supports this displacement-based target theory. Even some of the grievance-based targeting didn't seem to make sense given just what I saw on Twitter. So we'll see if we ever get a look at the actual RCMP assessment or a real and legitimate assessment, what real theories may look at. I have my own ideas, which I'll develop as we get closer to writing an actual report on this. The other thing the authors identified was that the RCMP never said why they were writing a report about Wortman. Why are you coming up with this? It didn't seem to have a purpose in their own minds, or a clear purpose. Here's something that I think is really mistaken and shows, reveals the vested interest and bias that the RCMP was demonstrating. In the report, the RCMP said that Wortman's plan was the ultimate humiliation for Lisa Banfield, his spouse, many years, that he humiliated in the past in various ways. I'm not sure humiliated is the right way to put it, in fact. I mean, he was abusive, obviously, and controlling and all those things, but I'm not sure if it was, if humiliation is really the goal in that case. I mean, it's a side effect, certainly, but if it's I don't know if it's the primary goal in such a pattern of violence. I think it's more of a controlling, mindset. But what the RCMP says is that this was the Wortman's plan was the ultimate humiliation for Lisa Banfield. I think you would argue, no, it was the ultimate humiliation for the RCMP. He goes around, he does these things, and the RCMP is a step or two behind at all times. Wortman, in many ways, exposes the fragility of our security, exposes the, various levels of competence of the RCMP officers, and, demonstrates how somebody can get away with these things if they're determined to do so. So one could argue that it was actually the ultimate humiliation for the RCMP, and that he was somehow motivated to do that. Now, of course, the RCMP report doesn't get into that, because this shows how the blinders can apply when you have a vested interest in the outcome. They would have never, or they never seem to have, from reading the secondhand assessments of it, considered that as a potential theory. So what I think should happen now is that the Mass Casualty Commission should publish the full RCMP report. There's no reason why it shouldn't be published. We've heard all the details of these killings already. Why not? What's the purpose of holding back the psychological assessment done by the RCMP? I think it shows really their mindset as well in a certain way, and I think that's worth reading for everybody. And then the commission, they're spending all this money on everything else. Why not actually commission a forensic psychological autopsy to look at all of these, look at the evidence we've heard so far, and have somebody come up with an educated opinion of what took place? Maybe the only way we get it. It seems doubtful that the commissioners are going to do that work themselves just from the evidence. I think they'll rely on expert evidence to any extent possible. So that was what I saw from the evidence yesterday. I was really hoping, after I saw on Twitter that the individuals were being named and the theories behind each death were being identified, I thought that report would be available to view, but it wasn't. And there's no reason why it shouldn't be. I'd encourage the parties and the families, participants, to pressure the Mass Casualty Commission, make that submission to publish the entire report. No reason why it shouldn't be. So those are my thoughts on day 53 of the Mass Casualty Commission, and I'll be back on Monday, big week next week, with Darren Campbell, Chris Leather, and Lee Bergerman to all give evidence, and so we'll be back for that on Monday. So thanks again for watching, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.